One of Microsoft's top priorities this year is to migrate SQL Server workloads into the Microsoft cloud. And as a result, they're working with Adastra to help organizations in specific verticals like energy accelerate the migration of their SQL Server workloads into cloud. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about what that journey looks like, why you would want to move forward with that journey, and what the what offers and capabilities we as Adastra can bring with Microsoft to help you move forward on this journey. So just a few brief slides about who we are at Adastra. So Adastra, we're over 20-year-old organization. We specialize in helping our customers get value from data. This includes modern cloud architectures, modern cloud data estates, the data management, so the data is well governed and secured, the practice of analytics to realize insights from data, whether it be data democratization, self-service analytics, or advanced analytics, and digitized apps to enable the management and interaction and visualization of data. We have 26 professionals globally, 500 here in Canada. And as you can see, we have helped many Canadian organizations across many verticals migrate SQL Server workloads into Azure successfully. As one example, we helped CPA Canada migrate 25 SQL on-premise servers successfully into Azure. They wanted to simplify their administration. They wanted to reduce their total cost of ownership of operating, and they wanted to take servers that were dispersed across many data centers and get them consolidated into one location in an Azure data center. They also needed to solve a SQL Server 2012 out of compliance issue through the migration. And so in this 4-month journey, we were able to successfully migrate and enable successful interaction from a dependencies perspective from the SQL Server on-premise environment into Azure, covering the 25 servers, the almost 400 databases, almost 30,000 objects, and 20 terabytes of data in a cost model that, from a total cost of ownership perspective, reduced their cost of running SQL by 30%. And so this is just one of many success stories we have where we were able to successfully transition from an on-premise data center SQL Server estate to an Azure SQL estate. So, we as Adastra are recognized by Microsoft as the top partner in Canada in doing these modernizations, whether it be for data platform or analytics across many industries and verticals. And because of our partnership status with Microsoft from a badges and specialization perspective, we have access to the best funding channels. And, as you migrate data, there might be other things that you want to do in Microsoft Cloud, like maybe you need to establish a new Azure foundation. And in addition to migrating apps and data, you might want to migrate analytics. You might want to introduce a security practice within Azure. You might want to use Power Platform. You might enable data governance or integration paths. And so we help with all of these data ecosystem activities related to modernizing to Azure. And so we have a team of 500 specialists that help us do this. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about why Microsoft and how Microsoft is enabling energy organizations modernize successfully into Azure with partners like Adastra. So at Microsoft, they see digital transformation within the energy industry as falling into 4 primary customer scenarios and outcomes. The first is operate for the future, focused on providing the technology to empower you with the right information at the right time to ensure you can easily adapt to changing market and business conditions. It's about creating operational and supply chain resiliency while generating value for stakeholders. The second is transforming your workforce, focusing on empowering your workforce from the corner office to the energy production floor, or mobile workers with tools that improve collaboration and communication, both internally and with partners and suppliers. The third focuses on transition to clean energy and helping you achieve your net zero commitments through emission reductions and efforts to decarbonize. And reimagine energy with analytics and data to capitalize on your market position with growth opportunities for new products and services. So I'm not going to go deeper, like I do have a number of slides that go a bit deeper into each of these topics. But for today, what we'll do is send these slides over, but just give you a sense that, you know, there is a need to be resilient from a supply chain, to enable distributed workforces, to enable transition to clean energy, to be innovative with energy. And so modernizing into an Azure ecosystem, your data estate, is one of the foundational steps that enable these outcomes. So let me show you a few examples where modernizing data estate into Azure for energy organizations has enabled this type of new value. So here are some energy clients that we as Adastra have enabled in Azure. You can see a series of repeatable offers that we have. We'll send the slide over. Offers related to smart meter analytics and generation analytics and energy use analytics, retention strategies, forecasting solutions from a use perspective, from a price perspective, energy marketing solutions, predictive maintenance solutions. So we can help do all of these things through a modern Azure data, powered by a modern Azure data estate for our energy customers. And as a few quick examples of that, here we have enabled collaboration between Bruce Power from a nuclear operator perspective and researchers at the University of Waterloo, where the real IoT and nuclear production detail is shared between Bruce Power and the third party at the University of Waterloo, so they can model methods to reduce nuclear waste, to improve nuclear energy yields, and share those back to Bruce Power. So collaboration between energy providers and research institutions can be enabled if your data estate is sitting in Azure, as one example. Another example, we're helping Boralex with wind generation performance analysis, where they are generating energy data across their 500 windmills. We're using Azure IoT to collect and land that data. We're bringing enterprise data that describes the windmill assets, the location, and other type and other details together with third-party data like weather data into this analytics ecosystem. And then enable energy availability calculation, because obviously wind energy generation varies depending on wind strength. And so understanding in real time what's happening with wind energy, and in real time comparing that to the target power curve and identifying where there's any gaps. And so this ability to enable real-time insights on wind generation for wind farm operators is something that is possible through the ecosystem of data capability available within Azure. So another example is enabling better customer understanding of the benefits of solar energy installations. And so an example would be if I'm a customer and I've installed solar, I can log in, and that I purchased from Electra, I can log into an Electra portal and see in real time the energy use generation because I might be using energy directly from the panels. I might be storing it in batteries. I might be using it from batteries. I might be selling it back to the grid. And so in real time, I can see what my energy use portfolio is for my installation. And I can see what it would have cost me to generate the same energy if I were purchasing it from the grid. And so what it does is it increases my commitment to the solar energy solution, and it enables a new product as a service that makes the customer more sticky to Electra, right? And just a couple more quick examples. This is an example where at a hydro provider in Europe, we were able to create a digital twin, and through the digital twin, ensure efficient operations for their energy generation. And so as they manage the facility or want to position new equipment, or they want to train operators or understand the impact on sunlight to the operators, they can do all of this stuff in the digital twin environment to lower operational risk and ensure success as they manage and run their facility. So we start with a set of pictures from the energy provider. And then we turn that into a high fidelity 3D environment that can be navigated through a VR headset or a computer. And then that can be used again to train operators, to manage space, to monitor energy production, monitor IoT telemetry. You can see a pump on the bottom right corner that's green. That's live data telling me the pump is operating within appropriate parameters. If it were yellow, it would warn me that it's operating from an out of bounds perspective. And so you can, through the Azure data estate and the IoT capabilities and the digital twin capabilities, create these really impressive solutions. Or another example here is we helped an energy company map out the positioning through digital twin of their energy distribution infrastructure. And for example, if you had to have the right spacing between the different energy pylons, so that as to understand the impact to the wire, and when there's snow on the wire, how does that impact the pylon positioning? So lots of cool benefits through these digital twin capabilities as well. Okay. Another example is a carbon footprint analytics platform where we calculate carbon impact in Azure data for customers. Here's an example where we're doing it for Volkswagen. So at the region level, by brand, by type of facility, whether it's dealership or car wash or filling station or paint shop or whatever, understand what the carbon impact is of that from an electricity perspective, a heating perspective, a fleet perspective, because Volkswagen has made commitments to their customers that they will become carbon neutral. And so having the ability to calculate this in Azure through our Adastra carbon footprint analytics solution helps that energy customer or that customer better understand their carbon footprint and whether they're making good progress toward their zero carbon goals. And then finally, the ability to use smart meter analytics to monitor energy use in real time, collect that through a appropriate OSI soft PI architecture into a centralized Azure data estate, and then enable visualizations that help any organization understand across their facilities their energy use or any alerts or anomalies related to the energy use. Okay, so hopefully that gives you an understanding of the sort of transformational things that are happening in the energy industry and why a modern Azure data estate is essential to get there. And so the typical first step in being well positioned for this future is get your on-premise SQL Server data into Azure SQL. And by doing so, you'll be in a good position to benefit from these capabilities that I just described, and obviously and new ones aligned to your modern organizational strategy. Okay, so as I said, the Azure data estate enables these outcomes, and so why would you consider operating SQL Server in Azure? Yes, it enables these outcomes, but what are some of the other operational benefits related to this? So first of all, if you think of the pressures of operating SQL Server or your own data center and your own data center infrastructure, costs are going up, there's inflation pressures, you have tighter and leaner budgets, there are disruptions in supply chains, it's harder to get equipment in your own data center, and there are talent shortages where it's harder to find experts who can run and operate a data center today, and the labor costs for those people are increasing. So if you modernize to Azure, you get out of the data center business because you're letting Microsoft run and manage the data center, and you're just focused on using the data service rather than managing the data center. So in doing so, you reduce your total cost of ownership for SQL by over 30%. We've seen this time and time again across our customers when they do an all-up apple-to-apple comparison of operating SQL on-premise to SQL in the cloud. They see a significant cost reduction. While you migrate, you can leverage your existing SQL investments. So if you have existing investments in on-premise SQL licensing, you can apply those into the cloud. You can scale up and down on demand. So if you need to be lean for 3 months and then have heavy compute for 4 months and go back to lean again, you can do that on demand to lower your total cost footprint for running SQL. And you end up with better data protection. For my small and medium-sized corporate clients, they end up with a better security result when they modernize to Azure than when they try to run their own data in their own data center. You lower your technical debt because you're allowing Microsoft to manage the software and the software patching and the systems and the operating system system patching and the hardware provisioning, and therefore can be leaner and run at a reduced support team size. But then you're positioned for dynamic growth where you don't have to wait 6 months to acquire new hardware as you scale up or integrate a new corporate acquisition. So when you think of the value that you get by running SQL in Azure, you have a highly secure environment that has been that is monitoring and responding to threat signals continuously, that is designed and managed by 3,500 security experts, and is secured through a $1 billion a year investment by Microsoft. You enable innovation. A lot of the outcomes that I described previously, are possible only by running your data in Azure. And you can you never need to patch, never need to update your software. And not only can you modernize your data, but you can modernize your apps into this ecosystem as well. And because you can apply your existing licensing benefits, and because if you do a lift and shift of SQL 2012, for example, or SQL 2008 into Azure, you get free extended security updates. With the ability to be agile and lean and dynamic through the Azure SQL options, you end up running it much less expensively when compared to running the same workloads in AWS. So there's an approach called bring your own license, where you take your existing SQL Server license, you tell Azure Azure SQL, you're already licensed on premise, and then that will lower the cost of running in Azure by that over 50%. You also get a 4 times core multiplier, so that 1 core licensed on premise becomes 4 cores licensed in Azure, as a couple of ways to that lower the cost through the existing license investments. You get the free security updates I mentioned. You also get dual use. So if it takes you 6 months to migrate, you can run SQL in both places without paying for an extra SQL license. And to further reduce costs in Azure, you can buy 1 year and 3-year reserve capacities. You can run your pre-production workloads in a dev test subscription. And if you like the model that you have on premise where you license, like let's say you have like a virtual server, you license SQL on all the cores of the virtual server, and then you spin up as many virtual machines running SQL as you want on that virtual host. You can repeat that pattern when you migrate to Azure as well. So we can achieve excellence by doing this, right? You have this out-of-the-box enterprise class security and operational governance implicitly as you migrate to Azure, something that many SMC organizations don't necessarily have from a maturity perspective. It's immediate and implicit by running in Azure. You get the automatic security updates, the automatic security version upgrades as part of working with Azure. You get the automatic threat detection that I talked about, implicit high availability. So you don't have to do anything special. You run SQL in Azure, you get high availability immediately. And you give a default backup policy so that you'll be able to, like without additional effort, be able to recover SQL data, but of course you can customize it based off your needs. There's an auditing, a DevOps, a security ops, an IT ops governance ecosystem that's fully available. And you might have some tier 1 applications that need 99.995 level availability with active, DR, and ready replicas. That's all easily achieved, much more easily achieved in Azure than it is to implement internally. Lower the technical debt of running SQL, and you implicitly get this single pane of glass to administer and monitor and operate SQL. So within this secured data ecosystem, we can use platforms like Purview to work with SQL to easily discover and classify data. We can use Defender to check for vulnerabilities and proactively protect the data. We can use Sentinel to do advanced and real threat detection and remediate threats as they occur. From an access management perspective, we can do private endpoints so that there's no public endpoints attached to your SQL infrastructure, all running in a private VNet, which is hybrid networked into your corporate data center. We can have multi-factor authentication driven by Azure Active Directory secure policies, and then have all the granular permissions you're used to within the SQL ecosystem. We protect data at rest, we protect data in transit, we have row level security, column level security, field level encryption, field level tokenization, dynamic data masking, full auditing capabilities. So I think we're, as you can see, in a stronger position once the data is in Azure using this ecosystem of capabilities. In addition, if you have regulatory compliance requirements like ISO or GDPR, Azure is certified across all of those compliance requirements. And then the thing that will trigger the move to Azure could be different things. You might move because you're renting space in a data center and that contract's expiring. Or you may have acquired a new third-party company, but you don't want to move that. You want to quickly move that into SQL capacity that you can spin up at a moment's notice. Or you can adjust to new capacity needs that you have without delay. You want to get out of the software and hardware refresh cycle every 3 years, replacing your hardware and software. You completely get out of that life cycle. You want to better respond to security threats, better be positioned to be compliant, and you want to be able to innovate, do all the things that I described earlier as well. And if your software has reached end of support and you need the expensive additional security updates for things like SQL Server 2008 and 2012, you get access to that implicitly with a simple lift and shift into Azure. So when we think of migrating the data into Azure, we think of taking all of those on-premise SQL instances and through tooling, do an assessment and a migration, where we land the data into one of three form factors. Database as a service, typically when you have a self-contained database that doesn't need to interact with other databases, that is talking to and supporting a specific application. That's the database as a service use case. Versus platform as a service, where it's a fully managed SQL instance that looks and feels just like SQL Server, but is fully managed by Microsoft as a platform as a service solution, or an infrastructure as a service solution where you run a virtual machine. And that's what you do if you need to support older versions of SQL, like SQL 2008, SQL 2012. But if you're able to operate on the latest versions of SQL, you would tend to use the PaaS or DaaS approach. And in all cases, we have the ability to do what we call business critical or general purpose or hyperscale, so that you can support different types of applications. Your 99.9995 level SLA tier 1, which needs high availability, read redundant copies that are available for access and quick cutover, and active DR scenarios. Or a simple 95% SLA scenario where you just need to run a single database service on a highly available but single instance. So we support all those form factors. We support all those SLA levels, tier levels across all those form factors. So from an assessment to migrate perspective, if you need to migrate from an earlier version of SQL to a new Azure SQL MI instance, you can use the SSMA tool to evaluate the source database, compare it, indicate what your target is, and it'll tell you if there's any SQL refactoring required, where you have to update the SQL code and certain stored procedures or functions to make them work in the newer platform. The assessment tool will tell you that. And then Data Migration Assistant will tell you how long it will take and what the effort would be to be able to migrate this into Azure, and then keep the data in sync over time until you're ready to cut over. And so that's on the assessment side. On the actual migration side, you can migrate the schema and smaller volumes of data with the SSMA tool. Or if you want to migrate the data, but keep the data synchronized over a period of time until you cut over later, so you can have a parallel run period, you might use the Azure Data Migration Service. Or if we're migrating a large data warehouse and you need to have this high performance pipeline to migrate the large volume of data, then that's the role of the Azure Data Factory. And so we use this set of tooling to help you get into Azure SQL faster. Okay, and then as you migrate, there are things to consider from an app perspective. Migration is not done independent of apps. It's done side by side with apps. So sometimes we migrate SQL Server to Azure and keep the apps in the local data center. That works if the apps can go from a 2 millisecond latency to an 8 millisecond latency with no issue. And you need to put in things like an express route with some good bandwidth to support that. That's done sometimes. I'd say most of the time, though, our customers will migrate Azure SQL with applications. And so migrating to Azure App Service or Kubernetes Service or VM for the app tier is often an important part of your migration solution. And so we as Adastra, have deep experience migrating apps and data to Azure and can figure out, and the solution might vary. Sometimes it might be a lift and shift of virtual machines for app 1, and then it might be a full app service in Azure SQL MI modernization for app 2. And so we know how to look at the scenario and figure out what the right migration pattern is for that app scenario, and to ensure that those upstream and downstream dependencies interact and function effectively post-migration as well. Okay, so what does the journey of getting from this higher cost, less flexible current state a SQL Server in your own data center into the best target for modernization of SQL to cloud to be able to do all those cool energy outcomes I mentioned earlier and be able to benefit from all the benefits I just described by targeting Azure SQL. So the first step typically is you have to make the financial case, right? You have a set of stakeholders internally that all need to understand the financial impact and what the future total cost of ownership position will be as you transition from internal SQL Server to Azure SQL. And so Microsoft will engage and work with you in collaboration with Adastra in a 2-week effort to make the financial case and get support for your CFO, et cetera, to support the modernization journey. If you don't have that support yet, if that's already done, that's great. Let's get right to migration. For the migration itself, the first thing we start with is an assessment. And the assessment, and I'll have a detailed assessment on the next page, figures out all that inventory of SQL systems, evaluates if any refactoring will be needed, evaluates which form factor is right for each application, figures out the application ecosystem and dependencies and ensures those are addressed as part of the migration, and then roadmaps that out based off priorities within your organization and where you have the biggest pressures. We then, through that step 3, road mapping and validation of roadmap exercise, tee up the launch of the migration, and then we start migrating. Then we get into what's called either a migration factory model, where you can actually have Microsoft migrate your databases for you. And that works for simple scenarios where you just have a large number of databases and you just need to shift them from your internal environment to Azure, and you don't have to think of a complete application ecosystem necessarily, or think of redeveloping any code as part of that. Or you can work with us as Adastra to help with the migration from a complete ecosystem perspective and help you migrate and refactor code as part of the migration. And so based off the needs, we'll figure out whether Microsoft's own free migration factory makes sense or the Migrate and Modernize makes sense. And then finally, now you're in a position that you've done that for the first few workloads, you can start doing this at scale. And for the first few steps, that's step 1, that's step 2, that's step 3, that's step 4A, this can be heavily Microsoft funded, right? So Microsoft and Adastra can heavily fund those initial steps, those heavier lift steps, that then enable us to position you to do it at scale going forward. So as a quick summary, right? This is what the offer that we have covers, the getting started offer. So step 1, we'll work with you and perform discovery. What are the set of data and applications that are candidates for migration? What is the highest priority that might need to be migrated? And what are your strategic objectives and what are you trying to achieve through the migration? And then we'll make sure that all your functional and non-functional requirements, so tied to those different tiers, right? The non-functional requirements for a tier 1 app to have an active DR, for example, and up to the minute backup and recovery is different than, say, tier 4, where a single server installation and up to the hour recovery is sufficient. So we'll make sure we fully understand those things. Then, if you have a full registry of all of your SQL Server instances, then Adastra will work with that registry to plan out and assess the sizing and scope of what needs to be migrated. If you don't have that inventory, then this is where the Microsoft assessment desk can plug in. So Microsoft has their own assessment team that uses Movir that can come in and scan your network and find your SQL Server instances and detect the dependencies between that system and your other systems. And then ensure that all of those and all those dependencies and all of that scope is considered when you think of your migration roadmap, and you properly come up with a total cost of ownership view of what it would take to run this in Azure. So if you have the inventory, great. If you don't, the Microsoft assessment team comes in and helps build out that inventory. Then based off that inventory and your requirements and the discovery, we'll create that prioritized migration backlog with you. We'll identify the target architectural patterns aligned to the different application tiers, like I described, from a service perspective, from a network perspective. We'll identify different migration patterns you might require. There's a difference between migrating with a no-freeze approach, where you have to migrate in real time and cut over to the second. That's very different than if you were migrating with a freeze approach, where you could say, turn off the application at midnight on Saturday, do a backup and migrate the data, and then turn the application on by Sunday at 6 a.m. That obviously that's a very different migration approach that would be used. Then we can work out the details with you and help you understand clearly what the cost of running this Azure by different tier would be. It's also important, especially if these are newer workloads for you in Azure, to establish all the good governance approaches, the FinOps, the IT Ops, the NetOps, the Security Ops, the DevOps. Make sure that that is established in part of your migration, because you want to be positioned to operate well. You may be doing all these things already in Azure, and we're just adding more Azure SQL workload into those approaches, or you may want help from a partner like Adastra, who's established those governance patterns at many organizations, to help establish those with you. And then identify, how are you going to support the SQL from a roles perspective, and what are the role-based access controls you're going to have to provision, and how are you going to protect sensitive data, and how are you going to recover through your non-functional requirements appropriately, audit through your requirements appropriately, get this certified through your architecture review board, make sure that we capture through the SSMA tooling any need to refactor code, so that you would never want to migrate a database and then find out after the fact a quarter of your stored procedures are broken. Let's figure that out up front, so that becomes part of the effort to migrate. And then define the migration roadmap, define the decommissioning plan, get that approved, and get migrated. So this is that initial 4 to 6 week effort that we saw on the previous slide. On average, it costs about $50K to do this at a typical medium-sized corporation, to execute this assessment and plan this out for all of your SQL servers. It can be done with much less effort if we're just focusing on a very specific SQL Server workload, but to do it holistically, it does require that 4 to 6 week effort. Typically, it has a $50K cost to do this, including the initial pilot workloads. And so what we're offering is, if you want to start this journey today and are willing to get it started before the end of June, through Microsoft investment and Adastra investment, we will come in and do this assessment and do the pilot migrations at no cost to you, right? So this is a unique opportunity. Microsoft and Adastra are making available twice the funding that is normally available for migrating SQL Server to Azure. So twice the funding that's normally available is available until the end of June. That can make these initial steps and many of the follow-up migration steps free to you, and all this fully funded, all of Adastra's effort fully funded through the Microsoft and Adastra investment. So I think a really exciting opportunity, right, to do something that your organization may have been thinking of or might not have been thinking of, but will immediately solve many of your challenges. Okay, so just to summarize then, what we talked about today is we talked about the imperative to, and maybe let me just move quickly to those slides just so that we can have a quick refresher on the slides that we were looking at as a final summary. So we talked about the imperative for energy customers to modernize into Azure, to be able to be more resilient, generate new value, enable a modern workforce, enable a transition to net zero commitments, decarbonization, and green energy, and reimagining new products and services that you can deliver as part of your energy role. We shared a number of examples where Adastra is doing this across many Canada-based energy customers, and a number of repeatable solutions deployable in Azure that use Azure SQL and the Azure data ecosystem to do things like smart meter analytics, so solar panel analytics, energy use forecasting, and others. A few examples that were only possible in Azure, like collaboration between Bruce Power and the University of Waterloo, like real-time analysis of wind power generation and comparison to power curves and detecting underperformance, promoting stickiness to solar energy installations for customers through real-time monitoring of solar value and solar energy use through a smart meter solution working with solar energy installs by Electra, and then comparing that to the costs of running the same solution, the same energy use without the solar panel installation. Use of Azure Digital Twin to map out and manage your facilities more effectively or your energy distribution more effectively. The ability to do carbon footprint analytics to understand your current state for carbon footprint and manage your goal of go to zero or net zero carbon targets. And empowering that through things like real-time smart meter analytics that uses the Azure ecosystem and OSI protocols like OSI Soft Pi to enable that type of energy use analysis. These are some, 1% of the possible outcomes that are empowered by moving to Azure SQL. And so we talked about all the benefits and the imperative and the value realization that occurs through that, what the journey of modernizing looks like, and the offer that we have to get started. Okay, so hopefully this gave you a good sense of why this now is the right time for energy organizations to modernize their data into Azure. I'll just pause for some Q&A and see if anyone has any questions regarding the topics today. It was a fire hose of information, and because it's Friday before March break, we don't have, we had 25 registered, but thank you for joining. But we obviously didn't have the full 25 join, but yeah, please don't hesitate to share a question before we finish up. Happy to take questions. Amanda has also shared some polls, just if you could go into the chat and see if you can answer those poll questions before we finish up as well. That would be great. Okay. Well, no questions, so thank you very much for your time today. I hope you got some interesting insights and value from the session.